Evening of September 28, 1799. Suvorov in the Muton Valley learns of the terrible situation of his army. French forces under the command of Masséna began to concentrate against him. Masséna went in person through Lucerne to Altdorf to Le Courbe, where, however, they found nothing but sad traces of retreat in the form of dead or dying men and animals. The French commander then rushed to Schwyz, taking with him some of Le Courbe's forces. So at Schwyz, Masséna would concentrate between 11,000 and 15,000 men in the next few days. Le Courbe's division numbered about 5,000 men. Molitor's forces, reinforced by Soult's division, numbered 5,500 men. The situation for the Russians was made even worse by the fact that Emperor Paul's son, Constantine, was present with the army. He could not be allowed to be taken prisoner. It was simpler to die, but even a fool can die. Suvorov must get the army out of the encirclement. The Allied army in the Muton Valley was in a tired condition. The soldiers were having trouble finding food to eat. But despite this, the inhabitants of the valley spoke well of the Russians. Franz Betschart writes that they could sell cheese to the Russians for 15 shillings a pound, while the French and Austrians, and even their neighbors from Glarus, were stealing and robbing. Similarly, in the minutes of the Muttental convent, the abbess wrote, "The Russians paid for almost everything they took, except the fee for the maintenance of the wounded. The Austrians and French have paid nothing." The Commissioner Fassbin also speaks very well of the Russians and says that they robbed only when the inhabitants of the Muottenian Valley asked them to pay 3 times the price. On September 29th, Suvorov decided to gather in the Muottental Monastery Military Council. Only Russians were invited. One of the participants of the campaign recalled from Bagration's words, "Prince Bagration came first to Suvorov and found him in great excitement. In full field marshal's uniform, and in all the orders, he walked with quick steps around the room, and without even noticing the arrival of Prince Bagration, curtly said to himself, 'Parades, great respect for yourself. Turns around, hats off. Yes, and it is necessary. And what is more necessary is to know how to fight a war, to know the terrain, to be able to calculate, not to deceive yourself, to be able to strike, to kill so many thousands. And what thousands? In one day. God have mercy.'" Obviously, Suvorov spoke with Emperor Paul about the Battle of Zurich. All together entered the field marshal's room. Suvorov stopped, made a bow, closed his eyes, and seemed to gather his thoughts. After a moment's silence, he suddenly looked over everyone with his quick, fiery eyes and began to speak solemnly, strongly, with enthusiasm. "Korsakov is defeated and driven beyond the Rhine. Gotzi is missing and his corps is scattered. Jellachich and Lincoln are gone. Our whole plan is scattered." He blamed the Austrians for everything. "We are now among the mountains, surrounded by an enemy who is superior in strength. What shall we do? To go back is shameful. Never yet have I retreated. To go forward to Schwyz is impossible. Masséna has over 60,000, and we have not even 20. Besides, we have no provisions, no ammunition, no artillery. We have no one to help us. We are on the edge of destruction. Now there is only one hope in the Almighty God, and in the bravery and selflessness of our troops. We are the Russians. God is with us. Save the honor of Russia and the Emperor. Save the son of our Emperor." With these words, he threw himself at the feet of the Grand Duke Constantine and burst into tears. General Derfelden was the first to speak on behalf of all the Russian commanders. He vouched for the unfailing courage and unquestioning self-sacrifice of the army, which was ready to go without complaint wherever the great commander would lead them. As a result, it was decided not to go to Schwyz, but to move through Mount Progel to the Kental Lake, Glarus to join the Austrians. Offenburg's vanguard moved in this direction already on September 29th. The advance of Derfelden's forces was planned for the next day. General Rosenberg was entrusted to command the army's rearguard. Suvorov ordered him to hold back the French at any cost from the direction of Schwyz. During this time, all the wagons were supposed to cross the Progel. September 30th, Masséna decides to make a reconnaissance of the enemy's positions with all his forces, about 8,000 men. Rosenberg had from 4,000 to 5,000 men. In the morning, French patrols came across the advanced Russian posts. A firefight started, but soon everything calmed down. Rosenberg's troops stood quietly all morning. Rosenberg himself with 3 regiments stood camped near the village of Muottental. General Rebender with his regiment, 1 battalion of Jaegers and 2 infantry Cossacks regiments stood in the vanguard on the left bank of the Muotta River. A mile and a half to the west stood the Jaegers and several hundred cavalry Cossacks. The advanced posts were commanded by Major Sabanayev. The other 3 regiments were still crossing the Kinzig-Kulm Pass and had not yet descended into the valley. Around 2 p.m., Mortier's troops attacked Sabanayev's advanced posts. The Russian Jaegers, shooting back from the thick masses of the French, began to retreat to Rebender's forces, which had begun their movement. Encountering the enemy columns with rifle volleys and grape shot, the Russian battalions rushed into a bayonet attack. 6 times the Russians attacked, and 6 times they were repulsed. The forces of Rosenberg's vanguard were exhausted. At this time, a fresh French column came up and forced them to retreat. 1 Russian cannon lagged behind the main line, and the French killed the artillerymen and captured the cannon. Then Rebender jumped to his battalions and shouted to them, "Guys, the cannon has been taken from us! Forward!" Hearing this, the whole line rushed again with bayonets, pushed the enemy with fury, recaptured their cannon, and captured French howitzer. The stubborn battle had already lasted more than 2 hours when the other 3 regiments finally arrived to reinforce the vanguard. They moved through the first line. These troops bravely rushed into bayonet attack and quickly began to push the enemy, while the Cossacks were disturbing the French flanks. The enemy's forces could not withstand the onslaught and began to retreat. As the valley gradually became constricted by the mountains, the French had to roll up in a single column. The road then crossed a bridge to the left bank of the river. The Cossacks, eager to chase the French, crossed the river and rushed toward the enemy's rearguard. The French were quickly routed. Only the darkness put an end to the pursuit. The Russians withdrew to their former positions. Only 1 regiment with Cossacks was brought forward. This was the first day of the Battle of the Muton Valley. Masséna was preparing for the second day. After the heavy fighting, the Russians suffered a severe shortage of food. Some were lucky to find something from the lying French. Masséna received reinforcements, which strengthened the French army to 15,000 men. Rosenberg's forces also grew by the arrival of the remaining regiments and now numbered about 7,000 men. October 1st, morning. The French troops moved into the Muton Valley. At 11 a.m., they attacked the advanced Russian posts. The Russian forward posts were ordered not to engage in a stubborn fighting with the enemy, but to retreat, luring him to the open plain. Masséna led the attack in 3 columns, 2 on the right bank, the 3rd on the left. Soon the entire Russian army was lined up in 2 lines. Rosenberg rode along the troops and encouraged them, ordering them not to waste time on skirmishing and fight with bayonets, as Suvorov taught. The first line split up and took position on the flanks, while the second line moved forward. The French were not confused, seeing a formidable enemy, and moved in 2 lines on the offensive. But suddenly a terrible volley bombarded the French with a hail of bullets and grape shot. The whole Russian line, with a cry of "Hurrah!" rushed into bayonet attack. The French stopped, hesitated, opened a rapid fire. The Russians broke swiftly into the first enemy line. After a brief fight, the French were unable to withstand it. They ran away. The second enemy line tried to stop this onslaught, but was also knocked down by Russian bayonets. The entire French forces fled the battlefield in disorder. The French had taken into account all the difficulties of retreating from the plain across the bridge the previous day, and so built fortifications in front of it. While the main troops were rushing across the bridge, the French rearguard took up a strong position covering this escape. This position was covered on the left flank by mountains and on the right by a river. A battery of 5 cannons also protected the road. A small Russian column climbed the mountains, came to the left flank of the enemy, and attacked him. At this time, the rest of the troops were advancing from the front. The French rearguard was crushed. All the guns were captured by the Russians. The Cossacks pursued the fleeing French for a long time, cutting them down and taking them prisoner. The French withdrew to Schwyz and began to prepare for defense. 1 Russian column even reached the town of Brunnen near Lake Lucerne, but quickly retreated to the main forces. Thus ended the Battle of the Muton Valley, a brilliant victory over Masséna himself. French losses were up to 3,000 men and 6 cannon. Russian losses were less than 1,000 men. On the morning of September 29th, Auffenberg's brigade crossed Mount Pragel and faced Molitor's battalion. The Austrians quickly pushed back the French, but Molitor brought reinforcements. By the end of the day, the French had managed to gain a foothold on the western edge of Lake Kental. Molitor had a total of 5,500 men, but they were scattered from Kental to Molis. Auffenberg's forces and Bagration soldiers, who approached on September 30th, numbered about 4,000 men. These forces also received some reinforcements from Schweikovsky's division, which was marching behind. On the morning of September 30th, Molitor began the offensive. Auffenberg held back the onslaught, and a sluggish skirmish continued until evening, when Bagration arrived. He began to outflank the French left flank, and Molitor retreated to the eastern edge of the lake. During the night, the Russians climbed the mountains to threaten the enemy's right flank. On the morning of October 1st, the general attack began. The Allied onslaught from the front and flank was unstoppable. Molitor began a hasty retreat to Netztal. Here he took up a new position. The Russians were able to cut him off from 2 battalions of reinforcements from Glarus, which then crossed the Linta and moved to Molis. Molitor could not withstand the new Allied attack, and pursued by Bagration, began moving towards Nefels. Before that, he burned the bridge at Netztal. But it didn't stop the Russians. A stubborn and brutal battle ensued at Nefels and Molis. After tenacious and brave resistance by the French, both villages were taken by the Russians, but Molitor received fresh reinforcements from Soult's division. By evening, the French were able to retake Nefels and Molis. Both sides were exhausted. It's hard to talk about casualties in this battle. Both sides may have lost up to 2,000 men. Suvorov was able to break the ring of encirclement, taking Glarus. Here he will remain until October 5th. Many are surprised by such inactivity of energetic Suvorov. Some claim that he waited for Rosenberg's rearguard. Some point out the miserable condition of his army. The troops were exhausted, hungry, they lacked ammunition, artillery is badly weakened. All this probably influenced this stopping and abandoning the idea of going through Molis to Sargans. The Russians didn't know the exact strength of the enemy in the north. Also, the fate of Rosenberg was unknown, and in case of defeat of the Russian rearguard, Masséna could go to the rear of Suvorov. The army was also weakened by the Auffenberg's departure for unknown reasons through the Panics Pass to the Lincoln's force. Thus, at a council of war on October 4th, it was decided not to march to fight its way north, but instead to march south to Elance. The army's movement began on the morning of October 5th. The command of the Russian rearguard was entrusted to Bagration, who was able to hold back the French forces. Molitor, after a short pursuit, stopped his troops. The Russian army, which was already in a terrible condition, had to cross the Panics Pass. This pass was more difficult than St. Gothard's, but nevertheless passable. But in these days, suddenly deep snow fell. It meant that the Russians would have to do a crazy crossing again, but fortunately, the last one. The narrow road, which could only be traveled singly, lay for the most part on the edges, with a chasm below. The higher one climbed, the steeper and more difficult the ascent became. Often clouds blocked visibility, and the soldiers moved almost blindly. Huge rocks rolled down into the chasms with a rumble. The remaining cannons had to be thrown down, all without distinction. Soldiers, officers, generals were barefoot, hungry, exhausted, wet to the bone. Some made a wrong step and fell with the stones. With the onset of darkness, people lay down anywhere, on snow, stones, leaning against a rock. To all the horrors of the night, the cold came. Some soldiers froze. The road became slippery. The descent down the mountain was also difficult, with men literally sliding down a 30-degree slope. Probably about 200 men died during this crossing. Finally, on October 7th, the Russians reached Ilens, where they got a long-awaited rest. The next day they moved to Kur, where they found large supplies of food. The army's joy had no limit. This is how Suvorov's Swiss campaign ended. Army's losses are difficult to determine, but according to formation reports, the number of the army on September 12th was equal to 21,285 men. By October 12th, it was reduced to 16,054 men. Accordingly, on paper, the losses amounted to 5,231 men. Most likely, the real losses were higher. However, we do not know exactly. Therefore, the losses of Suvorov's army amounted to about 25%. Undoubtedly, this campaign resulted as a defeat for the Allies. Masséna's victory at Zurich decided its outcome. But Suvorov's fault in the defeat is minimal. His actions were brilliant. Finding himself completely surrounded in the Muton Valley, he was able to turn the Masséna's main forces into a panic rout from the battlefield. With his other hand, he defeated Molitor and led the army out of the encirclement. Suvorov won all the fights. There are very few generals who would have been able to lead an army out under such conditions. Napoleon could, Wellington probably could too, but a less talented general would have been forced to surrender or would have been destroyed. Anyway, this strategic defeat led to the collapse of the alliance between Russia and Austria. In these days, Suvorov received rescripts from Emperor Paul, which ordered him to prepare, in case of breaking the alliance with Austria, to withdraw back to Russia. Paul's final decision took place on October 22nd, when he received news from Switzerland. He attributed the failure at Zurich to the fault of the Austrians because of the withdrawal of their troops. Also, the Russian secret advisor in Vienna, Kolyshev, literally demanded from the head of the Hofkriegsrat, Tugut, explanations for the occupation policy in Italy. The Austrians avoided answering. Paul wrote to Emperor Franz, "Seeing that my troops have been abandoned for sacrifice to the enemy by that ally on whom I relied more than on any other, seeing that his policy is completely opposed to my interests, and that the salvation of Europe has been sacrificed to the desire to spread your monarchy, I now declare that I shall henceforth cease to care for your benefits and shall attend to my own." When the Austrians received this letter in early November, they were confused. Some thought that Paul would not execute the threat. Suvorov foresaw these events and had already retreated to Augsburg, where he received a letter ordering him to return to the motherland. It ended with the phrase, "You had to save the Tsars. Now save the Russian soldiers in the honor of your sovereign." The return to Russia began. Emperor Franz wrote to Suvorov asking him to delay the retreat, but the field marshal carried out the will of his sovereign. On his return to Russia, Suvorov received great marks of honor from Paul. He was given the rank of generalissimo. Suvorov was the fourth person in Russian history to hold this rank. The next and the last generalissimo was Stalin. Paul ordered a monument to be built to the generalissimo. It was the first monument in the history of Russia to be erected to someone who was not a czar. It was opened in 1801. But Paul had a difficult and changeable character. During his reign, a man could for a short time fly to the top of the career ladder and then just as quickly fall to the bottom. So it also happened with Suvorov. As soon as Suvorov, who fell seriously ill on the way, entered Russia, Paul made a reprimand to him about a trifle that did not seem to be very important. Konstantin Pavlovich said that his father became envious of Suvorov's fame. The envy appeared also to other participants of the campaign. He forbade Suvorov to enter St. Petersburg in the daytime. Severely ill Alexander Vasilievich entered the city only at night. The second and the last disgrace began. No one dared to visit Suvorov on their own initiative. All were afraid of the emperor's rage. Only the poet Derzhavin was not afraid and visited the dying old man. He was in a feverish delirium. On May 18, 1800, the heart of the great commander Alexander Vasilievich Suvorov stopped. One of the best generals in the history of Russia died in disgrace of the emperor, almost alone. But Russia will remember her son through eternity.